Street Fighter 2 is of course an iconic video game that is not only credited for famously rejuvenating the arcades, but it would of course set the blueprint for the versus fighting genre as a whole. This legendary title could be seen in every corner we looked in the 90s, with arcade cabinets being located at every turn. Aside from the original version that would captivate the public's attention, the brand would of course also quickly become synonymous with the ridiculous amount of reiterations that it would receive. From the World Warrior to Champion Edition, Turbo Hyper Fighting, Super Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. There is no doubt that Capcom took advantage of their cash cow, releasing the same game with tweaks and improvements over and over again. Something that the cheeky buggers are still taking advantage of, as evidenced by the ludicrousness that is Ultra Street Fighter 2. Back in the 90s, Capcom were not the only company out there who were hungry to eat that sweet Street Fighter 2 pie. So naughty people over in China and Taiwan would make their own Street Fighter games. One of these was the Taiwanese studio known as Hummer Team, who would not just make a conversion of Street Fighter 2, but a conversion to run on hardware that Capcom had not bothered to cater towards with the franchise. So with all of this said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the crazy NES version of Street Fighter 2. Yeah! We have certainly discussed Hummer Team in the past on this channel, but for the sake of first time viewers' sakes, let's mention them again. Hummer Team were essentially a group of developers who are behind all sorts of crazy, unlicensed conversions that are available to play on 8-bit Nintendo hardware. Thanks to this group of pioneering pirates, we can play the likes of Donkey Kong Country, Super Mario World, and Final Fight 3 on a platform that Nintendo never intended us to. But before any of these dubious delights ever existed, Street Fighter 2 would serve as Hummer Team's first major bootleg, which of course was created in an attempt to capitalise off of the popularity and success of Capcom's sensational fighting game franchise. However, before we move on any further with this, let's not beat around the bush and look at this game's awesome introductory sequence. I mean, how absolutely amazing was that? Not only do we get the classic pan up the skyscraper, but the music has been hilariously botched, making it sound like we were about to experience Street Fighter, but in a nightmare. Bloody brilliant. This of course is all just a mere fraction of what is to come. Released in 1992, just 1 year after the World Warrior hit arcades, Hummer Team's conversion of a game, which would carry the exact same name, would be made available on Famicom cartridges. This game, published by Konami under their YokoSoft alias, would, as the title suggests, attempt to be Street Fighter 2. And yes, just to be abundantly clear, when I say Konami, I am not talking about the Ugandan militant and Christian fundamentalist of the Lord's Resistance Army who abducts children and turns them into soldiers, but instead the equally seedy Taiwanese software publisher. I guess the name Konami and dubious practices must go hand in hand. I'm just sad neither Konami tried releasing the Konami PlayStation, as both operated in grey markets. As for Hummer Team's first effort at creating the Street Fighter 2 game published by Konami, what would ultimately be delivered on the hardware would be a somewhat simplified experience in comparison to what could be found in arcades, or on 16-bit home consoles, restricting gamers to a roster of just 4 characters. In this game's instance, Ryu, Chun-Li, Guile and Zangief. Each character also has their associated stage recreated for the Famicom hardware, but in terms of fighting, have more simplified movesets than what can be found in official versions of the game. For example, Zangief is missing his spinning pile driver. The game features difficult AI to contend with, which I guess is needed considering how short this title actually is. After choosing which fighter you want to play as, there are 3 other selectable fighters to compete against. After they have all been defeated though, players do battle against the Dictator, who functions as the final opponent in the official versions of the game as well. Rather than being called M. Bison like in Western versions, or even Vega like in the Japanese version, Hummer Team appears to have spelt his name wrong, resulting in the character being referred to as Vigor in this game. Thinking about it, the English that can be found in this game is one of the most entertaining features of the whole experience, as beating the game with each fighter results in different text-based endings that unfold on our screens. Let's read Ryu's dialogue for example. Ryu's desire is to be a competent wrestler. He lives a roaming trip for the present. Hai still is not a competent wrestler. He has no setting place and job. All of his property are a suit of kung fu clothes and a ribbon which is tied on his head. Whatever season and weather, he always wears a set of kung fu clothes, walking alone on his road. Everyone who meets him would think so. Where does this guy come from? Now, if that isn't genius level writing, I don't know what is. But it demonstrates that the bootleggers were more than capable of building on Street Fighter II's established lore. In fact, each character included in this version of the game has their own epic ending, which all in all adds to this game's ridiculous bootleg charm. Perfect. Something I have yet to touch on, which I perhaps probably should, is where the game was sold. Basically, by the mid-90s in Japan and most of the West, we had 16-bit home consoles, with some people even moving on to next-generation hardware such as the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. However, in other parts of the world, particularly developing nations, they obviously lacked technologically behind. They were not just behind in electronics though, as in many instances, copyright legislation didn't exist around video games as of yet, thus meaning that games such as Street Fighter II, programmed in Taiwan, could actually be perfectly legally distributed across many countries around the world. Through this era, in regions where nations had recently left the Warsaw Pact for example, with the Iron Curtain lifted, new trade and economic opportunities were on the up, in turn helping Famicom systems and their unlicensed video game libraries flourish. For example, to this day, you'll find more people nostalgic for the Pegasus in Poland than you will ever for NES. And who can forget the impact that was the amazingly named Ending Man Terminator 2. This version of Street Fighter 2 catered to this huge market's exact needs. Other than simply being sold as Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior, to take a more cautious approach in some markets and try to remain under the radar a little bit, this game was also sold as Master Fighter 2 The World Warrior, so clearly some precautions were taken, which I guess was particularly important with legislation constantly evolving. With regards to this game though, would it really even be a Street Fighter 2 conversion if it didn't receive updates and reiterations? Well, not in a faithful sense at least, but fortunately for this Taiwanese game, it would get plenty of them. Next, gamers would get Super Street Fighter 3, a bootleg conversion of Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. This one would not be published by Konami, but instead by the JY Company. This version of the game expands the roster up to 9 selectable fighters and offers up a marked improvement from 4, but it still lags behind the real Champion Edition's roster count, which contained 12. Most of the characters in the game have their well-known accompanying stage backdrops too, except Chun-Li, who has a completely original stage for some reason. Being from Taiwan, maybe the developers felt they knew more about China than the Japanese, who developed the original game, so decided to insert a more appropriate traditional backdrop. Maybe they felt a backstreet featuring a market of a man strangling a chicken didn't best represent what China was all about. Aside from this substantial change, it seems that the developers tried their best to include gameplay that resembles its official counterpart. However, sadly, combos are not actually possible, so it looks more like Street Fighter 2 than it plays like Street Fighter 2. Graphically, at the very least though, I do think this is a step up from Master Fighter 2. The next game in this series, which would be published by Supertone Electronics and Yokosoft in 1993, would be known as Master Fighter 6, because after all, why let logic stand in the way of progress when it comes to the chronology of such a historic series? In fact, screw it, Master Fighter 6 was the correct logical title for the video game. It wouldn't be in the spirit of bootlegging if the numbering actually made sense. As for Master Fighter 6, it contains the iconic introductory music from the first Master Fighter game, and now has a selection of 3 difficulty settings. But it is the character select screen whereby things get truly ridiculous. Now players have a choice of choosing between 24 different characters, which is obviously a huge roster, bigger than real Street Fighter 2 games. This means that lucky gamers who had the pleasure of owning this one could play as 24 persons in total. Why does this give me vibes of something we looked at 2 weeks ago? Well, it's because the sneaky sneaksters pulled off exactly the same shenanigans. Essentially, the bootleggers took the 12 fighters who were already included in the Street Fighter 2 games, doubled them up as palette swaps, gave them new character select screen pictures, and hilarious new names. For example, Ryu is now called Nan, Chun-Li is now called Amy, and Sagat is called Marcus. Because Sagat really looks like a Marcus, doesn't he? Shameless and ridiculous. Other than the cheekiness with the game pretending that it has double the number of characters that it actually has, the game definitely builds on previous bootlegs, delivering a much larger and more fleshed out experience. Assets from both previous efforts have been taken and reused, as well as the implementation of many new ones too. This was the brightest, boldest Street Fighter 2 Famicom experience as of yet. It wasn't just the gameplay itself that was replicated either, as the game's library and box artwork has also been based on another source. The Master Fighter 6 box and cartridge is heavily inspired by the artwork of Tetsuo Hara, the man who illustrated Fist of the North Star. Or in heavier relation to this channel, Hara was the man responsible for the box art for the Muscle Bomber games, which we looked at in depth recently on here. Master Fighter 6's box artwork rips off his established style, including the face-off, but at least it is very striking looking, which is a massive positive. To continue to cash in on the success of Street Fighter 2, Hammer Team would develop yet another title in 1993 to carry the Street Fighter brand name, with this next title being simply sold as Street Fighter 4, successfully continuing the tradition of completely ignoring making numbering make chronological sense. Surprisingly, despite carrying the name Street Fighter in the title, in a shocking twist, this game would pretty much function as a completely original fighting game that did not feature a cast of characters or stages ripped from Capcom games. But they would still use Capcom's Street Fighter brand to try and help this title sell more easily. While the game's characters and stages are original, it becomes clear that many of the attacks and special moves that can be utilised in the game have been ported over from Hammer Team's previous efforts, making the Street Fighter 4 title fairly faithful, I guess. BootlegGames.fandom notes that although the graphics for this game were not taken from Street Fighter 2, some were indeed taken from the Japanese version of Shatterhand, so things in the game are still far from original. Later, in an attempt to distance itself from Street Fighter, the game would be sold under the title of The Legend, and be sold on 15-in-1 cartridges in 2005. Moving forward through time, Hammer Team would continue to find new uses for this fighting engine, resulting in games that deserve their own standalone videos, such as the outrageously ridiculous Kart Fighter, which predates Super Smash Bros. But as for games based on Street Fighter 2 specifically, that just about wraps up Hammer Team's efforts in such a department. As for the NES Street Fighter 2 games though, efforts continue to be made up until this day, with a conversion of the game currently being in development known as Street Fighter 2 Deluxe, which I would love to consider covering in the future. Such a fan-made effort is shaping up to potentially be the most impressive of the lot, which could result in the best NES Street Fighter 2 game yet. Back in the 90s, when we were enjoying Street Fighter 2 on our Super Nintendos and Mega Drives, others were enjoying Hammer Team's Taiwanese efforts on their Famiclones, which, officially licensed or not, function as an interesting chapter in video game history, and the direction for Hammer Team's bootlegs past this game. These games are a surprising amount of people out there Street Fighter nostalgia, and this should be celebrated. Anyway, subscribe and watch my video now on 18 Persons Edition. Yeah.